Well, when it really gets down to it, I mean, we have to understand this system that we live under, that now among Trump circles, people call it globalism. But it really emerged in like around the time of like 1900. Capitalism in the Western countries went from just being factory owners and factory workers to being big banks and big monopolies that stretched their tentacles all across the planet. And
Right.
that was a big game changer, right? Marx had always talked about the workers versus the bosses. But Lenin comes along and he says, well, it's actually not the workers versus the bosses. It's these big bankers, these big imperialist monopolies that are dominating the world and keeping the world poor in order to keep themselves rich. And the struggle is not the workers versus the bosses. It's rather the nations of the world struggling to break out of that system. That's what Lenin bases his entire movement on. And Lenin was a deviant Marxist. Bolshevism was like a weird spin-off of Marxism. And the Western Marxists looked at Bolshevism. They said, this is almost like a monastic religious order or a cult or something like that. This isn't real Marxism. This is a strange thing. Lenin has his whole party of new type, which is this very disciplined organization for only those who give the whole of their lives. He says nationalism can be good if you're fighting to break a country out of Western domination. He has this whole new interpretation of things. Trotsky doesn't really buy it. And for Trotsky, Marxism is a way to be Western. And it still does believe that the West is the best and the West is the center of the world. And that Marxism is just kind of continuing the ideals of Western civilization, taking them to their further conclusion, really creating an egalitarian society, on the basis of the French Revolution and that kind of thing. Whereas for Lenin and especially for Stalin, Marxism is a vehicle. It becomes a movement that is a basis for non-Western countries to establish their own identity, break out of the Western system, and begin to go their own way and build themselves up. That is the fundamental difference in interpretations. And Trotsky, he repudiated his theories of permanent revolution. He said, "Oh, I apologize." He joined the Bolsheviks in July of 1917, but he still held on to that worldview. And ultimately, he disagreed with Stalin on the question of China. He disagreed with Stalin on a number of points. He ended up getting kicked out of the Soviet Union. He moved to Turkey. He moved to France. He moved to Mexico City. And in the final years of his life, he was basically aligning himself with fascists and with Nazi Germany because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And like one big thing the Nazis were playing up is they wanted to break Ukraine away from the Soviet Union. They were, promoting Ukrainian nationalism. Well, Trotsky organized his followers to have a movement for an independent socialist Ukraine and to call for Ukraine to break away from the Soviet Union. In Spain, you had the Spanish Republic that had a lot of communists in the government, facing a fascist Franco trying to overthrow it. Well, the Soviet Union is organizing volunteers from all over the world to go fight for the Spanish Republic. And so Trotsky and his followers in Spain launch an armed uprising against the Spanish Republic, saying that it's holding back the working class, etc. And that, at the final year of his life, 1939, the Republicans in the United States, Martin Dies forms the Dies Committee, which eventually becomes the House Un-American Activities Committee, investigating Roosevelt for his ties to the Communist Party. Trotsky is invited to testify before the Dies Committee, and he agrees to do it. And the Republicans are going to fly Trotsky into the United States to give a speech to Congress against the Communist Party and against President Roosevelt. Now, ultimately, it was a bit of a scandal. Obviously, Trotsky's a Marxist. They're Republicans, so they rescinded the invitation. But Trotsky was somebody who had been part of the Russian Revolution, but had a falling out with the leaders of the Soviet Union. He fled to the West, and he functioned as a professional anti-communist for a decade or so, before ultimately being assassinated by an agent of Stalin, right? Because Stalin saw him demobilizing the war effort. Trotsky was against World War II, and he was having his followers go and try to organize a union to disrupt the U.S. military. When France was invaded by the Nazis, he condemned the Communist Party for building kind of a patriotic resistance to the Nazis. He was prepared to, play a disruptive role in World War II, and Stalin thought that was too much of a threat, that everything had to be done to defeat the Nazis. So he was ultimately killed. He was found guilty in absentia in the Soviet Union for allegedly conspiring with other Soviet leaders to overthrow Stalin. I can't confirm that that's necessarily true, but it appears to some degree or other fascists were boosting Trotsky. William Randolph Hearst, the anti-Roosevelt, somewhat fascistic conservative in America, was republishing Trotsky's writings. The Italian government of Mussolini was distributing Trotsky's writings. Trotsky became the spin-off interpretation of Marxism that was useful to the Soviet Union's enemies. Very similar to Gregor Strasser. right? There was a Nazi who had been a founding member of the Nazi Party along with Hitler, a guy named Gregor Strasser, who had a falling out with Hitler, and Hitler killed him. And so his brother, Otto Strasser, fled to Britain and had a radio program broadcast into Germany from Britain saying, well, I'm a true Nazi and Hitler's a big sellout. I'm the true National Socialist. And that this kind of thing happens. This is how intelligence and geopolitical games are played. Trotsky switched sides in, when it came to the Soviet Union. He was working against the Soviet Union. He developed a following of intellectuals who wanted to be with him so they could be ultra radical. They didn't like the Popular Front. They didn't like aligning with Roosevelt and the kind of vague anti-fascism that the Communist Party emphasized in the late 30s. But eventually those folks, in their alienation from American society and their alienation from Roosevelt, and then ultimately their refusal to really go at odds with U.S. foreign policy, ended up forming their own kind of separate movement. And the leader of that movement was a guy named Max Shachtman. And it's so weird because Max Shachtman, he's kind of unknown outside of Marxist circles. But think about post-war American politics. Jeane Kirkpatrick, she was the UN ambassador of Ronald Reagan. She was once a follower of Max Shachtman. Carl Gershman, the head of the National Endowment for Democracy, he was once a follower of Max Shachtman. George Meany, who headed the AFL-CIO in the 50s and 60s, Max Shachtman was his personal secretary, his top advisor. And Max Shachtman is this deviant Trotskyite, this Trotskyite who broke with Trotsky. You can play, 6 degrees of separation. He is connected to the entire political apparatus, the New Left, Susan Sontag, Hannah Arendt, Mary McCarthy. All these people, they trace back to Max Shachtman. He was kind of the intellectual father of all of this. Bayard Rustin, who was, Martin Luther King Jr.'s key strategist, also trained and a follower of Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman, who became useful to American intelligence starting in the late 1940s, he ends up becoming this very, very influential figure who is guiding all kinds of forces that end up being the leaders of the political left, the founders of DSA, Michael Harrington, Irving Howe, they're followers of Max Shachtman, and the neoconservatives, Irving Kristol, the father of Bill Kristol. It's kind of amazing to see how connected Max Shachtman is to the American establishment.
To both sides.
Both sides, yes, right, because they both share this kind of celebration of the West and American individualism and this opposition, right? And that DSA is people in the Socialist Party who eventually formed the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and Social Democrats USA is the wing of the followers of Max Shachtman who were supporting Republicans, who were supporting Richard Nixon. And it's fascinating to see that the left and the right, they all can get traced back to this obscure Marxist guy who was kind of their guru, who was teaching them. And he was gradually becoming more and more pro-U.S. He supported the Vietnam War. He supported the Bay of Pigs invasion. And he ultimately endorsed Richard Nixon in the final year of his life. He first supported more moderate Democrats, Henry Jackson and Hubert Humphrey. But when George McGovern won the 1972 Democratic primary, he thought George McGovern was too soft on communism, and that George McGovern wanted to immediately end the Vietnam War. No, we got to fight the Stalinists. So he endorsed Richard Nixon in the final years of his life. He dies shortly afterwards. However, his followers go on to kind of establish what's now considered neoconservatism. Irving Kristol, the father of Bill Kristol, his New York Times obituary, you talk about that elitism. It tells the story of how he stopped being a leftist. And he says he got drafted into the army. And when he was in the army, he says he had written about the working class before. It was the first time he actually met them, and he didn't like them. And he considered them to be, dangerous. They're a bunch of toughs. They're anti-Semitic. He says, I can't build socialism with these people. They'll just try to make a racket out of it. And that he's an intellectual for a reason. He's better than these Midwestern street toughs, he calls them, that are in the military with them. It's contempt for the people. That is really what flows through it. And Leo Strauss, who was never a Trotskyist, he's a philosophy professor who fled Nazi Germany, and he becomes kind of also the guru to these folks. And his whole thesis is that the philosophers of history have all had to write in code, because the masses of people will persecute them if they find out what they really think. And that we have to create a society where the philosopher kings, in the Platonic sense, the superior intellectuals, won't be messed with by the vulgar mob, the masses of people who would seek to suppress them. That's the narrative, and that they equate Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and they see them both as expressions of excessive democracy. When ordinary people, stupid, ordinary rabble who aren't smart and intellectual, when we get involved in politics, we set up authoritarian regimes that threaten freedom. And so everything needs to be done to control the masses of people. And the noble lie the idea that it's okay to lie to those masses of people because they just can't understand politics, right? They just can't understand it. So it's okay to manipulate and lie to them. Leo Strauss, his favorite TV show is Gunsmoke, the cowboy TV show where the good guy wears a white hat and is all good. The bad guy wears a black hat and is all bad. He says that's how average Americans should come to understand politics. And interestingly, as neoconservatism cements itself in Republican circles, we have two presidents who take on a cowboy persona. Ronald Reagan is literally a cowboy actor from Hollywood. George W. Bush is born in Connecticut, but yet he's putting on his cowboy hat and he's out on his ranch with his dog Barney and all of that. And that this had a lot to do with the neocons and how they crafted strategic messaging and winning the American people to support the wars. And their mission is to carry out a crusade to spread freedom around the world because these regimes out there, they threaten the precious freedom of the intellectuals. They see, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, all the various governments the USA has overthrown. They're an example of the rabble getting together and threatening their freedom.
Okay, so